Hey, Irene, did you ever hear about the time that Holmes and Watson went camping?
Holmes and Watson went camping.
Yep, they sure did. They spent all day hiking through the woods looking for a good camping spot. And by the time they found one, they were so tired they set up their tent and went straight to sleep. Except, during the night, Holmes woke up and he asked Watson a question.
I say, old chap, open your eyes and tell me what you see.
Well, Holmes, I see a clear night sky full of sparkling stars.
Very good indeed. And what do you deduce from this observation, Watson?
Well, Holmes, I deduce that
there are no clouds in the sky, that it's a fair evening, and it shall be free of rain.
I say, old chap, what do you deduce?
I deduce, Watson, that the fact that you can see the stars in the sky, I deduct that someone has nicked our tent.
Oh, dear Holmes, yes, you're right.
But who, pray tell, would do such a dastardly deed?
Ha ha ha, suckers.
Excuse me, sirs. Would you like to buy a paper? No, I would not like to buy a paper.
Bunch of cheapskates, you lot are.
Hi, welcome back to Absinthe and Ink. I'm MJ, and I'm a lifelong Sherlockian. And in this video, I'm going to share some interesting Sherlockian trivia with you, which you may or may not already know of. And in addition, last weekend I spent quite a few hours working on this. This is the Lego Sherlock Holmes book nook, which was just released at the beginning of this month. And if you're watching this video in the future, this month means June 2025. And I'll be sharing some of the building process with you. Now, if that sounds interesting, stick around. And even if it doesn't sound interesting, well, stick around anyway, because as Sherlock Holmes said, the game is afoot. Except it wasn't really a foot, it was a Lego set, but you get the idea. Now, my lifelong love affair with Sherlock Holmes began when I was a little kid watching the old black and white movies with Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce. Now, I was too young to read and appreciate stories from the canon. And to be honest, if you've seen those films, you know that doesn't really matter because the movies don't really have much to do with the original stories. But even if they did, the stories for me were secondary because I was so infatuated with the characters of Holmes and Watson. Now, when I did get a little bit older and I could read the canon, I devoured it. And in 1984, when Granada dropped the Sherlock Holmes series with Jeremy Brett as Sherlock Holmes, my love affair with Sherlock Holmes was firmly cemented in my head and in my heart. Now, if you were paying attention, you noticed that I used the word canon twice to refer to the Sherlock Holmes stories. Well, a canon, as you may or may not already know, is usually something that pertains to religious documents. And a canon is a collection of writings that are considered original and authoritative. And the reason that the Sherlock Holmes stories are referred to as the canon is probably because there's been so many pastiches done. And, well, you know that a pastiche is something that is done in the style of someone else. So when you hear somebody refer to the canon, they're talking about the original 4 novels and 56 short stories. Now, I don't know about you, I've read some pastiches and I kind of have a hard time really buying into the stories. Some of them were pretty good, but for the most part, they really aren't doing it for me. But if you know of some good pastiches that you've enjoyed and you want to recommend, please let me know in the comments down below. Now, probably the best place to start with Sherlock Holmes is, well, at the beginning. And that would be with A Study in Scarlet, which was published in 1887. And this is the story where Holmes and Watson first meet. Except it almost wasn't Holmes and Watson. It was Holmes and Sacker. Now, I don't know about you, but Holmes and Sacker sounds kind of like a personal injury law firm. Now, granted, that's probably because the names Holmes and Watson have been so firmly ensconced in our culture that anything else just sounds a little weird. I probably would have been okay with Holmes and Sacker as well. Now, Sherlock Holmes' original name was Sharonford Holmes. And how did Conan Doyle go from Sharonford to Sherlock? Well, there's a lot of really good debates and theories about how he came up with the name Sherlock, but I'm going to go with what Conan Doyle said in a 1922 interview with a newspaper when he was asked about how he came up with Holmes's names. Now, he stated that he liked the name Holmes because it sounded homely. And Doyle wasn't out to create a detective with a descriptive name. And Holmes was a pretty common surname during the time. Now, as for the name Sherlock, well, Conan Doyle went on to explain that years ago, I made 30 runs against a bowler by the name of Sherlock, and I have always had a kindly feeling for that name. Now, fans of the great detective know that he was actually based on a real person whose name was Dr. Joseph Bell. And Joseph Bell was one of Conan Doyle's professors when he was studying medicine at Edinburgh University. Now, Joe Bell, as Conan Doyle referred to him, had amazing powers of observation. Doyle said that Joseph Bell could learn more about a person just by observing them than most physicians could do by doing a thorough examination. And there is no doubt that Bell is the inspiration for Holmes because Conan Doyle himself wrote a letter to Joseph Bell in 1892 stating that it is most certainly to you that I owe Sherlock Holmes. Now, Sherlock Holmes himself still remains a bit of a mystery. Now, we do know some things about him, like Holmes was most likely born in 1854, and a lot of people tend to agree that it was sometime in January. We know that he has a brother Mycroft, who is 7 years his senior. Holmes tells us that he hails from country squires, and that his grandmother was the sister of the artist Vernet. Except he doesn't tell us which one. There was more than one French artist named Vernet. Now, the most likely candidate is this chap here. This is Horace Vernet, and he fits best into the timeline. Horace Vernet was a painter of portraits and military scenes, and as Conan Doyle's father was an illustrator, it makes sense that Sherlock Holmes would have some kind of connection with the visual arts. And of course, we can't talk about Holmes without talking about Watson, whose original name was going to be Ormond Sacker. Now, where Doyle got that from, I don't know, but I have read some things where people were speculating that perhaps these were street names that Doyle was familiar with. How he came up with John H. Watson is also up for speculation, but some people suggest that it's possible that Watson may have named Watson after, Conan Doyle would have named Watson after somebody that he knew that he maybe even went to school with. And at the time, there was also a famous surgeon who was a personal surgeon to Queen Victoria, and his name was Thomas Watson. And Thomas Watson also went to medical school in Edinburgh, and so maybe Doyle got the name from there. And here again, we don't know a whole lot about Dr. Watson either, except maybe he was born in 1852 or 1853, and that both his father and his older brother are deceased at the time that he meets Holmes. Now, Holmes and Watson were in their late 20s when they met up in a study in Scarlet and agreed to take rooms at 221B Baker Street. Except there wasn't a 221B Baker Street. Now, there was a Baker Street, and well, there still is, but there was no 221B. And Conan Doyle intentionally made up the address so he wouldn't accidentally use somebody's real address in the stories. Now, there is a 221B Baker Street today, and it's home of the Sherlock Holmes Museum. And if you ever get a chance to go to visit it, it's really worth it. The displays are really well done, and it really immerses you. It gives you that feeling of being in Holmes's world. Now, it doesn't take Watson long to realize that his roommate is a little different. And Watson makes a note of things that Holmes is ignorant of, things like literature, unless it's sensational. He knows nothing about philosophy or astronomy. He has a limited knowledge of botany, with the exception of being really knowledgeable about things like belladonna and opium. And the one thing that Holmes is really profoundly knowledgeable in is chemistry. And something else that Watson tells us is that Sherlock Holmes is a proficient violinist. And what kind of violin would Sherlock Holmes play except a Stradivarius? But where did the Stradivarius come from? Well, Holmes tells Watson that he bought it at a pawn shop for 55 pence. Now, there are two sides to this debate about this violin. One is that Holmes was sold a fake. The other is that Holmes would know that the violin was a fake, and that was the pawnbroker that Holmes got one over on, who didn't know that he had one of the most rarest and most valuable instruments in the world. But I kind of like the idea that Holmes just didn't want to tell Watson where he got it from, and that he was trying to see how gullible Watson really was. Now, Holmes and Watson both enjoy a good smoke, and so they tend to prefer the stronger and bolder shag tobaccos. But the pipe that you see Sherlock Holmes often smoking on his cover of books and his famous silhouette is a calabash pipe. And Holmes never smoked one of those. He smoked clay pipes, briarwood, and cherrywood pipes. He never smoked a calabash pipe. Now, we also know that Holmes enjoyed a nice glass of wine or claret, and he also liked a whiskey and soda. And, as we also know, he liked cocaine. Now, sometimes Holmes would substitute morphine in the place of cocaine, but cocaine was his go-to drug. And that really wasn't that strange, because cocaine was, well, it was legal and it was used for medicinal purposes. If you had a headache, well, cocaine. If you had a toothache, cocaine. If you had a colicky baby, you guessed it, cocaine. You just pop down to the chemist and get yourself a couple of grams and everything would be right as rain. But Watson did not approve of Holmes's little habit, because Watson knew that it was detrimental to Holmes's health. And eventually Holmes agreed with him and stated that, "I suppose that its influence is a physically bad one." Now, Watson did eventually wean Holmes off of the drug, but Watson knew that didn't mean he was cured. It just simply meant that the fiend was not dead, but sleeping. Now, A Study in Scarlet wasn't Conan Doyle's first offering. Conan Doyle had written a lot of short stories and some essays and had these published before he wrote A Study in Scarlet. Now, ironically, A Study in Scarlet, well, it didn't really flop, but it didn't do too great either. People weren't really that interested, and that was almost the end of Holmes. Until 1889, when an American publisher named J.M. Stoddard came to England looking for some English writers to expand his readership of Lippincott's monthly magazine. And J.M. Stoddard set up a dinner with Conan Doyle and Oscar Wilde. And Conan Doyle and Oscar Wilde got together, and Stoddard offered them a commission to go ahead and write some stories for the magazine. Now, Oscar Wilde wrote A Picture of Dorian Gray, and Conan Doyle wrote A Sign of Four, or The Sign of the Four, or The Sign of Four. There's been a couple of different titles for that particular story. Now, that story didn't do great initially, but as time went on, it became more popular, and Conan Doyle eventually became the household name that we all know now. Now, the Sherlock Holmes stories have been translated into over 98 languages all over the world. And if you're wondering what the most popular and well-known story is, well, that's The Hound of the Baskervilles. But Hound of the Baskervilles wasn't Conan Doyle's favorite story. His favorite story was The Speckled Band. His second favorite story was The Red-Headed League. And his third favorite story was The Dancing Men. Now, my favorite Sherlock Holmes story is undoubtedly Hound of the Baskervilles. And that's probably because during grad school, I spent a whole semester living, eating, and breathing this story. And I really grew to connect with it, and it is one of my all-time favorite stories. Now, my second favorite Sherlock Holmes story is The Musgrave, it's easy for me to say, The Musgrave Ritual. And my third favorite is probably The Red-Headed League. Tell me what your favorite is in the comments down below. Now, The Red-Headed League was also the favorite of a chap named Anthony Gavin, who in 1971 got the idea to rent a shop 2 doors down from Lloyd's Bank. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a spoiler here if you haven't read The Red-Headed League. But Gavin decided that he would spend his nights and his weekends tunneling underneath the shop next door and up into the vault of Lloyd's. And he almost got away with it. He got away with millions of dollars, him and his buddies. And only some of the people involved in the theft were caught, and only a small amount of the initial amount of money and valuables that was stolen was ever recovered. Now, this actually took place in London on Baker Street. Now, at the beginning of this video, I mentioned that the game is afoot, and Conan Doyle is often credited with the original usage of that phrase by Sherlock Holmes. However, Conan Doyle wasn't the first one who said it. It was used by a writer who, well, you might have heard of him. His name is William Shakespeare. And in Henry V, the king declares the game is afoot before riding off into battle. Now, Holmes is such a complex character. I could talk about him for days. And, well, I don't expect anybody's going to watch a video of me talking for days because I wouldn't even want to watch that. But I had a thought, and here's where I could use your help. Because I'm thinking maybe I could take some of the individual stories and do a deeper dive into those. Maybe look at character analysis, or maybe some historical events that were going on, or things that would have inspired Conan Doyle to write these stories. So if that sounds like something that you would be interested in, please let me know in the comments below. And also let me know if you have any interesting Sherlockian trivia that you'd like to share. So thanks for spending some time with me. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you next time on Absinthe and Ink. Bye-bye.